for realistic architectural visualization technology. The focus of our project this semester has been exploring the interoperability between Autodesk 3D Studio Max and Revit 2013 for the purpose of creating architectural visualizations. We chose this project when it was brought forth by Scott Schroeder, our group sponsor, who said that there's this new interoperability between the two software where you can import Revit files into Max for rendering. But the problem was there wasn't any set of defined guidelines as to the best way of going about doing this to make it both effective and time efficient. So we did that. We came up with our guidelines, and for our own practice and purposes, we ended up making our own schematic design booklets, which we'll get into later. Some of you have them right now out there in the crowd. Starting off, for those of you that don't know, architectural visualization would be computer-made images of to-be-created architecture. As you can tell from this right here, this model, this rendering, if you were showing this to someone, this is a great presentational tool, a great bidding piece. You could show the client what you're going to build in before anything's even begun, before anything's been bought, before the ground has been broken. You can completely tell what you're going to get. You can flesh out an entire building doing this. There'll be no questions left as to what is going to be made. So, great stuff to get into. Our process that we're talking about, taking Revit files from Revit architecture, importing them into 3D Studio Max, and then rendering them. From there, we'll get into this later if you need to, editing it up in a photo editing software. For our own personal goals, we were trying to decide when we thought the renderings were good and done, because if you didn't know, you can render in Revit, however, they're not very good. The quality isn't that great, so we thought, you know, if we're going to be doing this and we think it's going to be important to render in 3ds Max, we wanted to know that the renderings looked much better. And for us, we felt that to get photorealistic quality renderings would be the highest quality we could achieve doing this. Photorealistic just meaning that, you know, all your materials and your lights and your shadows are reacting like they would in real life. Pass this off to Brian a little bit here.
All right, so the main overlying problem, as we kind of touched on earlier, is that when you're importing these models into 3D Studio Max, there's a considerable amount of alteration that you need to make to these models to get them to a point where you can create photorealistic renderings from them. So basically, our hypothesis is that we believe that in order to quickly and effectively go through this process, you need to understand the limitations of each software package and understand what you should do at what step of the process and where you should focus at each step. So the first thing we asked ourselves is, has anybody already done this? We didn't want to copy anyone's work, and we wanted to create something that was original to us. And what we found is that the information is out there, but the problem is it's pretty dense. There's just a lot that's out there on architectural visualization, creating stuff in 3D Studio Max, and you really have to compile it all to get it to on your own to get to something that's pretty useful. It's also pretty confusing. There's a lot of interesting jargon that goes into creating renderings that for somebody who's new to getting into it, like we were at the beginning of the semester, it can be kind of confusing. Also, a lot of the sources that are out there are very specific to one project. You're basically watching somebody who has a screen cap go through their project from beginning to end. And that's helpful, but you really need to look at a number of those sources to really get a broad perspective of how the process works. And everyone seems to have a different opinion. That's one of the things about this architectural visualization industry, is that everybody kind of has a different take on how you should go about creating your visualizations and what's good and what's not good. So basically what we can conclude from this is that architectural visualization is an art form. Everybody kind of has a different way of doing it, like I said earlier. There's not necessarily just one right way to do it. There's plenty of wrong ways to do it, as we found in some of the research that we've done. But each person has their own artistic style. And the other thing that we learned is that we have a lot to learn. There's a lot that goes into this process, and we had our work cut out for us. So like we talked about earlier, there needs to be, we decided that there needs to be a set of guidelines that's kind of a broad set of guidelines that goes through this process that helps people who are just starting out, who might not have a lot of background knowledge. So the first thing we researched is how to use 3D Studio Max. Any of you who have ever used it know that there's a lot you can do with this software. There's a lot that goes into it, and it's kind of confusing at first. And So researching basically just how to use it, looking at tutorials and things like that is where we started. Also looking at MentalRay, we decided to use MentalRay for this project because it was readily available to us. And we were learning what all the render settings do in MentalRay, how they affect your image, how they affect the render time, how they affect the quality of your image, and also using render presets, which we'll get into a little bit when we talk about our guidelines. The last part of our research was just looking at the work that was out there, seeing what we thought was good, what we didn't think was good, and just seeing what other companies and other professionals were producing and kind of comparing what we were doing to what they were doing. And that was a pretty important part right at the beginning. Hand off to Max here.
So, when we got to testing, after we created our renderings, we got to testing. When we got to testing, we realized that testing a photorealistic image is kind of like tomato-tomato. It's really subjective to the viewer, and it can differ from person to person, and depending on their background and their experience. So one of the things we did was we took an image, one of our renderings, and asked them, how is this photo realistic or how is it not realistic? For example, someone may be looking at this and they can look at the comforter and the chair only and think that this photo is realistic because the materials are correct, the proportions of the scaling is right, and it looks great. But someone that kind of has a background in lighting or reflections, they can look at the picture above the bed and see that it's kind of too reflective and the lighting is kind of weird on the image. So, I mean, it's really subjective to what you're looking at or what exactly you're focusing on. So how we did testing, we did 2 rounds of testing. First round was preliminary testing, second round was secondary testing. And for the preliminary testing, we kind of targeted towards Purdue students and upperclassmen that kind of had a background in lighting or construction graphics. The reason we did this because we felt like they would give us positive feedback, great feedback, like constructive feedback and good criticism on our renderings. And so the second round of testing, after we got our feedback back from our renderings, we took them, edited them, and then sent them to industry professionals. We chose industry professionals that have a background in construction graphics or renderings. And these people, I mean, they work with us every day, they've seen a lot of it, so they know what a photorealistic rendering looks like. And so the second round of testing, we did that. So how we did testing was we did a survey on our website. The survey was password protected, so only the people with passwords that we sent the survey out to could access the survey. And first thing we did was that we gave them a definition of photorealistic rendering. The reason why we gave this definition to them is that we wanted like a level playing field. We kind of want to set a standard of exactly what we're looking for when they're looking at these images and when they're answering these questions on the survey. So how did we do the survey? We asked 2 simple questions for the survey. One closed-ended question and one open-ended question. The first question was basically, do you consider this photo realistic or not? It was a yes or no question. And the second question was, what corrections could be made to this image along the lines of light, shadows, reflection, and material properties. And so it was paired up with the image, a random image that would show up, and then they had to review it and see how did they think it was photorealistic or not. So this is a sample of our first preliminary testing. Preliminary testing, we did 6 images, and so the image on the left was had 81% people said yes, this is a photorealistic rendering. Like I said earlier, they probably said this because the comforter and the materials look great, but some of the shadows and reflections look a little off. And then, so for image 2, 52% of the people said no, this is not a photorealistic rendering. One of the reasons was that you could take a look inside the windows. They're really dark, they kind of look black. And if you go online to our website, you can see this in detail that the texture on the wall is off scale and it's a bit too big. It looks a little off, so that's probably one of the reasons why, that's the reason why people said no, image 2 is not photorealistic. In our secondary testing, you can tell our renderings got quite a bit better. The one on the left, 87 people said, yes, this is a photorealistic rendering. One of the reasons why they said that this was a photorealistic rendering was that the floor and the flooring material and the cabinets also looked pretty real, and the lighting was great as well. And then, so image 2, although, I mean, it's a good rendering, 63% of the people said no because they're probably looking at the comforter. The comforter looked too geometric. That's some of the problems we run into when we're creating renderings, that we don't want things to look too geometric. So yeah, number 2 was not as photorealistic as people thought it would be. So I'm going to pass this on to Keegan, and then go over the depth.
All right. So from our working through this process throughout the semester, we came up with the guidelines that we felt are what you need to know if you're going from Revit into Max for renderings, which, as you can see right here on paper, actually not that hard once you figure it out. You're going to start with your Revit model. You're going to import it into 3ds Max. Set up the scene with your cameras and lights. Stage the scene with furniture and materials. Apply the materials. Render it, and then if necessary, touch it up. So what we're looking at here is a screenshot of the house I modeled. This is the Revit side of it. I made this house in Revit. What I wanted to point out in this part of this guidelines is that for rendering it in Max, you don't want to spend too much time doing detail work in Revit. You're just going to want to get your basic architectural stuff down: walls, floors, doors, windows, roof. I'm going to get into it here in a second. Furniture in Revit is notorious for looking uncomfortable and awful when you render it. They're very cubey, and it's going to be a lot easier if you do that stuff in 3ds Max. Also, the lighting, I didn't mess with any lights in Revit or cameras. That was all done in Max. When you import the Revit file into Max, it's going to ask you how do you want to link it, and you're going to want to attach it by material. And that's actually the default mode, so you don't have to really remember that. Just click yes to everything. Comes in. Make sure, though, when you do it in Revit that all your floors and walls and such are at least made of different materials. Yes, you can change the materials in Max, and you probably will, but if you make everything in Revit a generic material type, it's all going to be the same material in Max. So if you try making tile floor, your walls and ceilings are going to be tiled as well. So just make sure that everything is separate materials in Revit. Setting up the camera, as Brian said, we spent a lot of time looking at pictures and photography to kind of get an idea of how to set up your cameras, because there is a good deal to that. And I mean, I'm not a photographer, but as long as you can see what you're trying to communicate to someone, that's really the most important part. Setting up your lights. This is an example of someone setting up a daylight system in 3ds Max, which is just a simple sun that comes with Max. We found that if you're just getting into this, starting out, this is probably the easiest way to light up your scene, because it's one light, and you don't really have to change much to it because it's the sun, and that's a constant. That doesn't, if you're doing man-made lights inside it, you can change so much stuff with that. I mean, you can make, what kind of light are you putting in, what filter color, and you can get into that, but for starting out, it's best to just go with one light source. As I said, with the Revit furniture being awful, you can find thousands of free furniture models online, and they will just make your scene look so much better. As you probably can see in some of our booklets, some furniture just comes in and you render it, and it looks amazing right off the bat. You don't even have to do much, which is just great for saving time and making a realistic looking image. If you still don't like them, you can change materials on them, or like for your floors and walls, you can put better materials on, stuff that comes with your render engine or with 3ds Max. This is where I found that with the materials really makes or breaks the realism of your image. We found that a lot of materials, if you're not careful, they come in way too glossy and reflective, kind of like that picture frame in Max's bedroom. If you're looking down there, there's usually a glossiness slider tab or reflectivity. A lot of times things come in way too glossy, and you'll have to make sure that you keep that tone down a bit, because you want light to bounce off of surfaces. You don't want to be able to see your ceiling reflected off your floor. It's not made of a mirror, it's just tile. That and the image scale is another big one. Sometimes material, especially with if you're doing tile flooring or hardwood flooring, it might look fine when you lay it down, but then when you render it, if you didn't look at the scale, you might have 6 by 6 foot tiles on your floor, which they don't even sell those, so no one's going to agree with that screw. The last step, going into your render settings before rendering. This is where it can get a little intimidating, because the render settings in this software are pretty deep. You're going to want to start with a preset. They should have preset renderings, as you can see down here. This is the Mental Ray Render Engine tab. And you can select some of their presets. You can create your own presets, setting your own stuff up, and saving out presets to save time later in the future. It's best to start there, because as I found out in the early phases of this project, when I was impatient and just wanted to get max quality, I cranked everything up and clicked go, and 20 hours later it was still gathering points, and then it crashed. And obviously that's not the best way to render stuff. So I found it's best, if you've never done this before, to start low, start for a lower quality rendering, and sort of work your way up to find out what you need. Because as also we found out, there are certain options in this that you will adjust by a factor of 1, and now your 1 hour rendering takes 15 hours, and it looks exactly the same. And so you don't want to you don't want to just go in there and blindly mess with stuff. All right, so as we've been saying too earlier with photo editing after you render stuff, this kitchen I rendered took, I'd say, about an hour, hour and a half to do. And at first glance it turned out all right, but if you can kind of see in these orange rings there, you've got sort of noisy pixels coming in on the table, on that window, right in front of the oven there. Not really sure why this happens, but you know, you could go back and mess with your settings. Maybe you can re-render it, maybe it'll clear it up, maybe it won't. You know, that's just going to be more time. But we found, you know, if you just take it into Photoshop and blur it out in 10 minutes, I mean, right there, now you've saved yourself a hassle of trying to go through that maze of settings and fix it. And like I said, that took 10 minutes as opposed to another hour, maybe even more. I'm going to let Max talk about our design booklets now.
So one of our final products was schematic design booklets. The purpose of schematic design booklets is that when you're creating renderings, they're just a photo. You just don't hand a client a photo. So when you have a schematic design booklet, it's somewhere you could include all those photos, all those photorealistic renderings, include a floor plan as well, and then kind of submit it to them and kind of sell your building or sell your apartment even before it's built. So for example, what's in a schematic design booklet is like kind of floor plan, highlights of the building, how big it is. And then if you kind of look through the schematic design booklets that we passed around, they typically contain renderings along with a short narrative of the room, and then just continue on into other renderings in the room as well. This is also Keegan's.
Yeah, this was just a quick, my house that I chose to do that you can see out there. Scott gave us a bunch of floor plans to choose from just for the purpose of creating renderings and kind of a shell basic house to go with. And to answer your question, Professor Conley, I am not auctioning this house off. It's actually Charlie Sheen's beach house from 2.5 Men, as you can see. So I think it belongs to him or the news network. Again, some renderings I threw in there. Some of the important stuff you want to see in a house, of course, master bedroom and bath, the kitchen, living room, amenities like that deck.
All right, this is my schematic design booklet. One thing. Started out with on the cover with a nice nighttime shot, a little silhouette of the building, just to kind of give a teaser of what it looks like. Inside we've got floor plans, like the other ones, and also some narratives and some information about the building itself. The first page has some exterior renderings. One thing that I did to save a lot of time on the rendering is, instead of trying to render grass, I just found images of grass that were in the right perspective and photoshopped them in. If you're good with Photoshop, this is a pretty easy way to achieve a pretty good looking result. And then some interior renderings, the living room and the kitchen, and I put the floor plans next to them so you can kind of see how the furniture looks, so you can reference it just directly. Alright, so the last part of our project is the legacy part. At the beginning of the semester, we originally created this web-based software. It's pretty simple. It's basically an image tagging system that somebody can go in, a client can go in and tag a part of a rendering and make a comment on it. It's pretty simple, and we originally intended to develop this into an app, but just because of the size of our group and the scope of our project, we decided to cut this out and leave it for a legacy project for future groups. There's a lot that you can do with this type of image tagging software and create an app, and there's all kinds of other editing things like optioning that you can do that would be a part of this as well. So that's all for a presentation. We would like to thank Scott Schroeder for being our sponsor, helping us out a lot, and also flying all the way out here from Colorado. We really appreciate all the help this semester. Professor Corey and Professor Chen, who helped us out with our testing and helped us with some advice along the way. And also Shannon Wart, who is our IAB member, and just a contact from the industry. She also helped us with some testing, and all the industry professionals that we sent out our survey to. We don't know who you are because they were anonymous, but we appreciate it. And also, of course, Professor Burton for running 411. All right, let's open the floor to questions.
Photoshop prior to this project? And if you didn't, do you wish you would have taken more classes that would have helped you in this end product?
Well, I can answer that for myself. Personally, yeah, I've used Photoshop since I was in high school, and I feel pretty knowledgeable about it. I can't necessarily speak for the other two group members, but
I mean, I took 211, so we did a lot of that, so I know enough to be dangerous, but I wouldn't consider myself an artist.
I think it's definitely important to have a lot of Photoshop knowledge when doing this type of work, because it can save you a whole lot of time, so you don't have to go back and re-render things.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to agree. I'm personally a graphic designer, so I know Photoshop quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier and faster if I know a lot of Photoshop, and you can save a lot of render time and just photo edit photos. Other questions?
So when you guys were doing your survey, do you think it would be easier if you used an actual photograph from your project? Because all you pick projects that exist in the real world.
Right.
So if you took, like a kitchen shot, you had the kitchen photo of the kitchen rendered, do you think that would have been a better survey or worse? Because then you get nitpicky. If you can't find the exact model, it'll be like, well, that plant's not red or whatever.
I think well, first of all, the models that we created were not exactly the same as the original floor plans. We did make some alterations, and obviously the furniture was our own design, the way that we set up the furniture. That didn't come from the floor plan, that was just from our heads. But I think that that would have been a decent test, but we weren't necessarily trying to make renderings that look exactly like the photos. We were trying to make renderings that were photorealistic. So.
Can you bring back up the slide with the two survey questions you asked?
Yeah. Come on.
Just scroll back.
Scroll back. Here?
Questions on it? The actual questions, yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Are those two questions supposed to be mutually exclusive? The second question, am I answering that is, what am I doing to make this image photorealistic, or am I just critiquing that image in ways I can make it better without actually forcing it to be photorealistic?
It's ways in which it's not photorealistic is
Okay.
what we're looking for. So we're looking for basically what threw the viewer off from it being a photorealistic rendering. And we got a pretty wide range of results from that. Some people just made very broad comments, and some people went into a lot of detail, which we definitely appreciated. But it was meant to just find what was wrong with them.
That's why I like too, as we said, one of the first classes we wanted to have people do take the survey was the rendering class, because we don't really have like a construction rendering class, so we're kind of new. I mean, I was pretty new to a lot of this stuff, so we wanted people who may be able to give us, helpful feedback about how to improve our images. I guess what I'm getting at is the second question, if you're trying to ask why it's not photorealistic, your second question is vague, because the way you've worded that, I could critique that image on what it is right now as a critique of that image, not of how I would want to art direct you towards the goal you're looking for. So I'm wondering if your data may have been skewed by the ambiguity of the question.
Yeah, I think looking at it, it could be a little bit more specified as to what we were looking for. We were trying to keep it broad, so I mean the goal was to get feedback so we could make our craft better and get to the point where we were creating really high quality images. So that was the main goal of our testing, and also to validate these guidelines that we've created. If our images come back and everyone says they're photorealistic, then we've done our job, and that proves that, or validates the fact that our guidelines work.
Can you go to the front cover of your booklet, the first one?
The first one.
No, the one with the picture of your model on it. So like a couple slides.
Is it the house?
Yes, this one.
Yes.
So you pointed out previously that this is an example of what you use for an image that's not photorealistic.
Mhm.
So why is it the cover of your booklet?
Well, funny thing about that one, I created this rendering, and this is why something I probably should have mentioned earlier, when you're doing different scenes of the same model, it's a good idea to always start with a new file in Max and re-import it, because I ended up doing another scene off of this model inside, and I ended up, because the grass, I originally had grass modeled in there, I later took it out and like Brian did, just photoshopped real grass in there, but at the time the grass model was slowing it down, so I got angry and I deleted that and accidentally deleted my camera and everything, and then, I did another one of the back of the house, fixing some of the problems I had with this one, but yeah, I didn't really want to, like for comparing my first to my second image, I wanted it to be the same angle and everything, and I would have had to reset up the camera, and there's no way I would have gotten it exactly the same as that. So that was a blunder on my behalf.
And could you go to the next slide? Or do the one after this one as well. So these are all stuff that you guys modeled?
Yeah,
So
this is the house that I modeled. These are rooms inside.
okay, that's much more representative
Yeah.
of what you guys did.
Yeah, these were better ones than mine.
And can you go to the night image? The next
That one.
Okay. So what about this one? Because I don't see anything, you know.
It was more just my intention was that it was kind of just a teaser, so you couldn't really. It looks a little bit better printed out than it does on the screen. If you can see.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can see a little more detail and things like that. The projector doesn't really do it justice, but it was just kind of a teaser to get the client interested in what it looks like in kind of an artistic way with the reflections off the lake and that sort of thing.
So you said that your goal here was mostly to set up these guidelines
Yes.
that would be useful. So did you focus a lot on creating what the actual guidelines are, as opposed to, okay, they said that this is, like on the surveys they say that maybe this is a little bit off, so you adjusted your rendering settings, but was that part of your guidelines? I mean, did you use your survey results to create your guidelines?
They definitely affected the guidelines that we used, and this whole process has been absorbing information from all sorts of different places, and our testing was definitely part of that. And then taking all of that information and compiling it into these guidelines that are a little bit more coherent and easy to work with, as opposed to going out there and doing all the legwork like we did. It makes it a little bit easier. So the testing definitely went into it, and there were some alterations that we made. Or I guess there was some input from the testing that went into the guidelines.
Okay. And I know we didn't show the actual thing, but we do have our guidelines written. Or do we have them up on the website now?
They're up, if you go to RAVTechnology.com, it's under projects, and they're downloadable. They're a Word document. So it's RAVTechnology.com.
And we've also made some of the render presets that we used for our project available as well.
Yep.
If anyone's interested in doing this type of work.
So now that you have these guidelines, what's the next step? Like, are you gonna publish them? Are you just keeping them on the RAV Technology site? Or how are they gonna affect, like, do you want them to go out to working professionals in the industry, or what's the goal?
Yeah, we've made them available to all the industry professionals that did testing for us, just as kind of a compensation. As far as next step, it was a sort of a process just for ourselves to get into this type of work, and it's definitely something that we would be sharing with anybody and everybody who's interested, and we've made it pretty available. So.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would like to. That was our goal, was to get it done and then be able to, publish them out to the general public. Up to this point, I've mostly been focusing on finishing everything and the presentation. So I guess that's definitely the next step would be to think about how are we going to get this out to everyone, other than just on our website that we have for the class. Yep.
The picture that you have of the bathroom, if you could just go real quick, the one. No, it's the one that's on your card.
I'm not sure I remember which one is on there.
Oh, that's my thing.
Oh,
Yeah, is your wall supposed to be like that kind of like paint dry, like rub, or is that the shadows doing that? Like, cause it looks like the shadows are a little blotchy unless that's your.
Actually, I think this is actually a different picture. I think this was one.
Okay,
So I had several versions of this rendering, and I kind of
okay,
did some in Photoshop. Some of the, like we were saying with the lighting and making,
The lighting looks good, but it's just the shadows
Yeah.
that kind of throw it off a little.
Sometimes they do get a little weird, and I think I actually did a little bit of blurring and smudging on those in Photoshop to fix
Also
it on
maybe
there.
the scale of our wall texture.
Well, I don't know
Yeah.
so much about 3D Max, but do you guys have like, is there final gathering settings in the
Yes.
render?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you guys tried upping that, because that might help with shadows?
Yeah, that was actually one of the things, the final gather settings that I found, when I was talking about how right in the beginning, I kind of was like, all right, let's set everything up and get a nice rendering. That was the one setting I found that it seemed like once you broke past like 200 or 300, you started just spending hours
Yeah,
rendering
that's-
it, and it really, some of them never looked that much better. Like I did one, I think the kitchen, I did one at like 1,000 final gather, and then I did another one at like 150, and I thought it looked
Okay.
almost identical.
That's the only problem, I mean, obviously if you up it, your render time will go up.
Yeah.
With the render settings, one thing that we were really looking at was trying to optimize those render settings so that we're spending 10 hours rendering, but still getting a result that is just as good. And as Keegan said before, you can spend 10 hours doing a rendering and get a similar result to a 1 hour rendering, and then doing a little Photoshop touch-up, you can really hardly tell the difference. So it's something that was pretty important to our project.
So the question's really not whether it's photorealistic, it's whether it's good enough.
Sometimes, yeah.
That's a good point,
It's whether it's in this type of situation, you could say, for instance, my nighttime scene didn't look that good on a projector. If you're presenting this to a client and it's something that's printed out, some of that quality is going to go away by putting it on a projector or printing it, as opposed to it being on a screen. So, sometimes it is. You have to say this is good enough.
So you talked about the materials in Revit, and I know at our company, the Revit team doesn't necessarily care about materials in the initial schematic phase. I mean, when you're doing a 14,000 seat arena,
Yeah.
So the problem is when I get the model, it's all generic.
Right.
And it's always a pain to connect everything together because either I get one massive clump of geometry that has all the walls in it and all the windows, or I have 107,000 pieces in there. What would you say is your recommendation for like a company that you have to push it to a Revit team? You're not the ones that Revit in, you're the Max guy. And you can scream and you can throw stuff, but they're just gonna do their own thing. How can you get them to do the materials or recommendation for that right off the bat? Because that's the biggest thing that's the biggest bottleneck in our process right now is cleaning it from Revit to getting to Max, or sometimes it's easier just to completely remodel it myself because it's
Right.
quicker, it's more efficient.
I would say, from a time standpoint, taking the extra time to apply, you don't necessarily have to apply a specific material as long as the materials are grouped differently, because when you import it into Max, you can group it by material. So you can say everything that's concrete is grouped together. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be, the material applied to it doesn't necessarily have to be concrete. It could be green or whatever. It just has to be different. And that's how it groups it when it brings it into Max. So, I don't know if I can help you with dealing with your architects, but
They all work, they generic materials, generic objects, generic everything.
and also from a visualization standpoint in the BIM model, it's going to be helpful to have things as different colors.
Well, the thing is, like, they don't start doing the visualization out of the Revit model until probably design phase, outside of schematic into design. So you're probably 2-3 years into it, but the thing is when they're building the initial Revit model for even the bid phase, when we're bidding on the project, they're just trying to get it done, so they can get something that looks nice in a 2D floor plan. And then they hand it off to me and like, well, why can't you make it look pretty?
I would say too, first of all, they shouldn't be modeling with generic wall and floor types, because as Clark has told us many times, that is not how you do it. Then you can't tell what's inside the wall, which defeats the purpose of information modeling. So right there, I would send them Clark's way if they're modeling it in all generic stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess, like we were saying, like Brian said, I guess that's a case-by-case situation.
Yeah, and industry standards for BIM, you would not be modeling things all generic, all the same material. So
It's just one of those
because
things.
that's part of the information side of it being a building information model is the materials.
Yeah, for our purposes, as long as it looks good in a floor plan they can build off of it, that's, realistically, it's kind of Revit's almost overkill. We probably should be back in AutoCAD for that stuff. they're pushing Revit on us, with their suites.
When you import a Revit file into 3ds Max, do you ever have any problems with normals, like face normals or like vertex normals? Are they ever reversed or anything? That be manually?
It's not necessarily an import; it's a link. So it's still a Revit file. It's just consumable by Max. So the file itself doesn't really change at all. But the way that it's rendered does change just because of the way that 3ds Max renders. But no, we haven't experienced any of that kind of problems when you're with the document itself.
Just going back to your hypothesis, like I've been looking at it. Sometimes it makes sense to me, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to me. So the research question I think is really good, and I think the answer from what I've seen is a combination of putting it into Max, getting it close enough, doing all the final details in Photoshop. Is kind of, that seems to answer the research question as far as like the quickest and most effective process. And in the hypothesis, it just says, in order to find the quickest and the most effective process, you have to understand how to use the software and its limits. And it almost seems like, that's kind of an obvious statement that may not necessarily be exactly testable. So I think that you answered the question in the elevator statement about creating the standards, but I think maybe that part of the elevator statement should have been in the hypothesis. So, we believe that creating clear-cut standards will lead to the most effective thing instead of just saying kind of generically like we think that you just need to understand how to use the software. So I think that I'm getting there, but I think maybe those could have been worded a little bit better.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you say that your goal is to make something that's photorealistic.
Yes.
So at any point, did you consider maybe actually trying to model something that you have of your work out to compare and contrast your renderings to a real image?
Yeah, and that's kind of what Scott was saying earlier, but we didn't do that at all, but I think that would be a helpful practice, is if you're trying to replicate an image. It does seem like a lot of work to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how
I was
helpful it would be.
sort of thinking like, because people have sort of like preconceptions when they look at an image, and so you can look at these images and be like, oh yeah, they look realistic. But then that's because we kind of have an eye to adjust it to make it look realistic. But if you put it next to something that's real, maybe the person would sort of start noticing more differences.
And the biggest problem though with that is, some of the, you look online too and you find some of the greatest renderings ever made, and it's to the point, I think, where it's so real, it's not real, because, if you take a picture of a room with a camera, well, what kind of camera were you using? If you had, the most expensive camera ever, or if it was disposable, if there's a flash, are you gonna see out the window, or is it gonna be reflected back? If you're taking a picture of a skyline outside and it's kind of hazy, if you did that in a computer, it would be miles of clarity. And so there are certain things that in the computerized world that you make that almost are too sharp to be real. But I see what you're saying. It would be cool to kind of compare the two.
And from an architect's standpoint, I think a lot of them would probably tell you that they would like their visualizations to look better than real, because that's showing what it could be in a perfect world, not necessarily what it actually will look like.
Right. I feel like your group kind of has this sort of two different aims here, but one is to make a very good construction model for like a company, and then another one would be to make something that's literally photorealistic. And so I'm kind of wondering, is your focus more to make something that's literally photorealistic, like a piece of artwork, or to make something that a company would want from you, want to buy?
Well, as far as the one side being more for construction and the other side for more visualization, the idea with the whole being able to link the Revit model into it is that you can get both out of, sort of like one task. So now it's because you can model the whole room in 3ds Max, but if you've already got a team who's modeling the building in Revit, that's a waste of time to model the actual structure in Max when it's not really built to make buildings. That's the Revit side. So in the end, at the whole end, you can get the nice renderings on one half, and then also you will have the full information model and all the floor plans and design work that you need for the builders.
Okay.
Clark, Juba. All right.
I'm just wondering, I don't really know
say now it's definitely a lot faster for me than it was back in February. But I can tell you right now, like that house I modeled in Revit, that's a couple hours, imported into Max, put up a camera, put up some, I mean, now that too, I've downloaded a lot of furniture components. I can set up a room and light it in under an hour, and then, I mean, like I said, that kitchen or this bathroom only took maybe an hour and a half to render, so I would think one work day, I could probably do that again, one of the renderings in the model. All right, any other questions?
One of the initial goals of this project was that if you were sort of hired at a company, like what I talked about, a lot of architect companies now, you're not really gonna be just the Revit guy, you're not gonna be just whatever, they tend to wanna use you for everything. Do you, now having worked through it, do you feel you would be prepared to go out in the world and do this? I mean, before you took this or after you did this process, I mean, where's your comfort level with this visualization process?
I would say right now, I feel confident that I could go out and you know, create visualizations like I have from Revit models or even modeling it in 3D Studio Max. I mean, I feel pretty comfortable doing it, and that's actually what I got hired to do, but not with architecture, with manufacturing. But yeah, I mean, I feel pretty comfortable doing it.
I mean, definitely. Before, I mean, we were just making Revit models in Clark's class, but now it's like I get to do 3ds Max, and I talk to my cousin, architect in California, and also works with 3ds Max to do photorealistic renderings here and there when they don't have someone to contact to do it.
Yeah, and yeah, I just definitely feel a lot more comfortable now doing that, which is why, again, we chose this project, because we didn't have this background in our classes.
Because more and more architects are starting to bring what they normally would outsource out, like where I used to work at Focus in California, we outsourced a lot to architects, and now I'm working in-house. I'm their first one that's ever done this, and so they're wanting to bring more people in because it's easier. I mean, the architect just come to my desk and be like, hey, change this.
Right. That's what my cousin's doing. His company usually outsources to a different company, and they pay him a lot of money to do it.
Yeah.
But if they need something quick, they need something that day, he's able to do it and kind of step up and take care of these photorealistic renderings when he needs to.
All right, well, that's about our time. Thank you all for coming out.
Sure.
Now, watch our presentation.